She sat on the same bench night after night until the sheriff uncovered her heartbreaking secret. Every night, an elderly woman sits by herself on a park seat regardless of the temperature. Sheriff becomes dubious, believing she is hiding something meant for removal. When he confronts her, he finds a heartbreaking truth that leaves him devastated. Permanently altered from where you are observing. Remember to subscribe and investigate. More tales from the peaceful streets of the little town that will inspire and move you. Town opened out before Sheriff Ray Harris washed in the muted illumination of streetlights. In his patrol car, he traveled familiar highways the same way he had every night for the preceding 15 years, his hands barely rested on the steering wheel, his mind straying between ideas of retirement and the annoyance that accompanied. From the sense that his work had lost relevance at 55, Ray was not unusual for the monotony of his work. He knew every pothole, every stray dog, and every restless young person leaving past curfew. Chilly autumn night, the breeze with the aroma of distant wood smoke and dropped leaves as Ray moved through town. His headlights momentarily lit the local park's gate. His eyes strayed to the closed 9 p.m. sign put at the gate, but then something else drew his attention. Focused on one of the park benches, Ray scowled. This wasn't the first he had seen someone seated there after hours. But now the shadow appeared smaller under the low moonlight. Older, irritated, he squinted and slowed his police cruiser to a stop alongside the curb. A woman dressed in a faded coat sat still on the bench in the park. Her stance slumped but strangely composed, sighed, unbuckling his seat belt. What now? He murmured, opening the door. His boots crushed against the gravel as he made rising with every stride. As he neared the gate, his path was irritable. Her skin was dark and aged, like the bench her features emerged from. Hair braided under a knit cap, she sat with her hands folded precisely on her lap as though the cold had no effect at all. A threadbare scarf hung loosely over her. Her sneakers were old and scuffed, hardly suitable for the cold. Her neck felt warm enough. Night park closed, ma'am, Ray replied sharply, a few feet away from her. You cannot. She was here, but she didn't reply. She sat motionless, her eyes far off, concentrated. Somewhere past Ray, as though she were waiting for someone or something beyond. The patience of the horizon. Ray narrowed. You hear me? Park closed, he repeated louder. This time the woman turned her head gently and raised her gaze toward him with weary but clear eyes. I knew, she whispered gently, her voice as quiet as her peace disturbed by rustling leaves infuriated Ray even more as he dealt with sufficient late night troublemakers and loiterers to find out when someone was tried in his limitations. What's your name? He demanded. You received ID. The woman gently shook her head. My name's. Unless you have a legitimate reason to be out here. Eva. Well, Eva, I'm waiting for you to move ahead. You can't just sit here all night. Simply, her voice steady. Ray folded his arms. Someone, Eva said. Who? My son responded to with a small smile that seemed to be caressing the edges of her lips, as though the very notion of him made her smile. Ray's jaw constricted at this hour in the middle of the night. That didn't sound right. He turned around, half expecting someone else. Your son is not now hiding in the shadows. Here still, she answered, her eyes straying back toward the vacant street past the park. Ray moved his weight impatiently. Ma'am, listen, I'm going to be real direct with you. You should leave this spot. I'll let you know. Had to bring you in. Eva didn't flinch. She tightened her fists on her lap. Her eyes remained fixated ahead. I assured him I would be coming. She mumbled Ray's words. I'm not sure what's going on here. Forcefully rubbing the back of his neck. Looks. But if I see you here once more, I am bringing you a no, and you cannot keep doing this. Eva just nodded. Serene's look, as though she had already approved whatever would happen, annoyed. Ray turned on his heel, stalked back to his patrol car. He once glanced over his shoulder, but hadn't moved. She sat silently, as though his warnings meant nothing too. As he slipped, Ray shook his head and murmured beneath his breath, crazy old lady. Entered the driver's seat and started to pull away from the curb. He felt an uncomfortable sensation related to something about the interaction troubled him, but he couldn't really identify it. The way she had stared at him so composed, so patient made him uncomfortable, as if she knew. Whatever he missed the following night rediscovered, he was following the same road. Monitoring the same streets, Eva was once more seated on the same bench in the same posture, as if she hadn't left at all. A blast of frigid air whirled across the vacant park, but she stayed still with her light coat pulled closely around her petite figure. Ray swore beneath his breath. Damn, did he. Pulled the patrol car to the curb and stepped out once more, his boots crunching on the gravel once more and again. Yelled out annoyance, lacing in Eva's voice. She glanced up at him with the same coolness as the evening before. Good evening, Sheriff. This isn't funny. Ray informed you park closed. What do you believe you are doing here every night? Eva smiled slightly, the kind of grin carrying hope and sorrow all at once. Once I was waiting, she added once more, her voice steady. For your son, Ray mumbled. Sarcastically, right? And from the moon, where is he expected to be coming from? Though Eva's smile wavered, she stayed calm. She will arrive, she said almost to herself. Ray's tolerance was running thin. Enough of this. If you. I will have to make a promise, Eva interrupted. Do not move forward. Gently, her voice slicing across the frigid night air. And I'll keep it no matter how long it takes. Anything. In her words stopped Ray in his tracks. For a minute he stood. She was staring at her, uncertain of what to say. Her quiet strength was evident. Something unsettled him, a feeling of direction he couldn't grasp, and started talking. Closed it once more, though. The words felt insufficient. With a frustrated groan, he turned and went back to his car, driving away. The same unpleasant sensation gwed stronger this time. What type of mother sits in the cold night following night for a son who never visits long after the frightening questions? His change stopped when he lay in bed that evening, fixating on the ceiling he couldn't get rid of. He knew he would be seeing Eva seated alone on that bench. Once more the wind howled over the vacant streets as Ray Harris's patrol car passed by black stores and silent homes. The night was colder than the last, and knowing without even looking that he was approaching the park, Eva would be seated in the same location, sure enough, covered in that same threadbare coat. Her scarf tightened around her neck, her posture changed. As motionless and quiet as always, the bench creaked only under her weight as she changed, but mostly, she could have been a statue in the night. Ray snarled his teeth. Why would this woman sit out in the frigid night after night? And why did she seem so composed and orderly, as she had all the time in the world? He disturbed him once he parked along the curb, once more closed the door. He walked into the night air with a loud slam, resolved this time to get responses. All right, lady. This has to end, she shouted, marching toward her. Eva turned her head. What are you actually doing here? Selling something, waiting for someone to pick you up? Gently to gaze at him. Her expression remained same. Good evening, Sheriff. Ray's jaw tightened, her politeness just to aggravate him further. Late evening, almost midnight. He looked at her, attempting to see any indication of drugs or drink, not at a bus stop, or dubious behavior. Her calm, consistent presence, as if she belonged there more than he did. Ray, you cannot be here now. Kept putting his hands on his hips. You could say I'm kidding. Here isn't a cover you need to travel, or I'll have to bring you in. Eva just shook her head, her look calm but stern. I cannot leave, Sheriff. Ray let out a annoyed moan, wondering why not. Because I told my son gently and promised when Ray returned I would be here. You keep narrowing your eyes and saying that. So where is he now if he hasn't turned up by now? What makes you suppose he ever? Eva lowered her eyes and properly folded her hands on her lap. Because he promised me to. Ray saw his irritation rising in his chest. Something about her clarity of quiet, unshakable faith caused him to have an uneasy sensation inside him. Better than to get ensnared in someone else's delusions, yet there was still a grief in her voice that gwed at him. Lady, you cannot sit out here every night, Ray replied, quieter this time, but still strong. What are you waiting for Eva to offer? A miracle? He gave a little knowing smile but said nothing. Ray hissed under his breath. You seem not inebriated. You are too old to be performing any sort of fraud. Why then do you not seem drunk? Hell are you doing? Eva changed her scarf against the chilly breeze. Some Pledges are valuable regardless of length. Ree felt the sheriff, no matter. Knot of irritation tightens in his chest. You know a great seat here, all night if you want, but don't say I didn't warn you when you caught pneumonia. He turned swiftly and walked back to his patrol car, slamming the door behind him. He briefly sat behind the wheel, flashing out at the vacant park and the lone person on the bench. Something about her presence, like a sliver caught too deeply. Why was she so damn stubborn? Why did he care? Ray drummed deep to reach his fingers on the steering wheel, weighing whether to call and back up or leave her alone. Felt incorrect, something other. Ray turned back toward the bench Eva sat on, not wanting anyone else to handle this scenario, as a breeze started up. Immobile, like if she were impervious to the cold, her gaze fixed on the far horizon as though waiting for the sunlight or something beyond it. The following evening, rediscovered, he was pulled back to the same place. It was starting to become regular, and hated that it made him feel as though she were under his skin, something he had vowed never to allow anyone do once more. She was exactly as he had anticipated, the air to be colder when he got there. This time, frost shimmered over the grass, but Eva seemed to overlook. You're crazy. You know, Ray called once more, and Eva looked up and grinned kindly. Good evening, Sheriff. Ray shook his head, frustrated. It's freezing out here, and you may die here. Eva gave a little shrug. You have any idea how dangerous it is to sit out all night like this? I'll be all right. Ray glared. Lady, you've been out here every day. This isn't games. Night for what? Days, weeks? What's actually going on? You avoiding something? Escaping someone? Eva's smile vanished in favor of a silent. I'm not hiding, Sheriff. Ray is seated on the edge of the seat, more out of annoyance than compassion. Ready for what precisely? You keep repeating it's your son. But where is he, and what type of person creates his mother? Wait out here every night. Eva's hands shook slightly, but her voice was constant. Ree sighed. What do you mean? Eva lacked options. Paused for a long time, as though deciding whether or not to tell the truth. At last she muttered, he was taken from me 20 years ago. Ray blinked, startled. Taken? What do you mean? Eva let out a slow breath that was clearly seen in the frigid air he was arrested in. Ree believed a falsely accused locked him away for something he did not do. Frigid chill settled in his bones, one unrelated to the temperature, and Eva nodded and said, he assured me he was going out soon. Said Mama, when I get home I'll see you in our park, so I'm here waiting. Race glanced at her. His mind whirled. Something about her didn't sit right, but also didn't feel like a lie. Why now? He questioned silently. Why would he be leaving after 20 years? Eva's eyes shined with unshed tears. The truth always finds a way, Sheriff. It just takes time. Ree sat in shocked quiet, his previous irritation subsiding into something lot more disturbing, and a painful empathy he avoided. Feel? He rose suddenly, brushing the frost from his sleeves. Gaze. I'm not sure what's going on here, but this won't keep you alive. You'll get murdered waiting like this. Ree shook his head. Certain things are worth waiting for. Eva smiled sweetly, annoyed yet reluctant to debate any more. You're useless. One last time, Eva sat while he turned around to return to his patrol car. Her eyes fixated ahead, almost as though she could see something on the horizon. Perfect still. For the first time in years, Ree felt the smallest, none else could, flutter of uncertainty, not about her, but about himself. Why did her story seem so real? And why could he not get rid of the impression that she was speaking the truth? Ray entered his police car and left into the chilly evening. Eva's silence trailed behind like a. He felt as though he will be seeing her once more, and next time, things wouldn't be so easy. The wind brought the winter's cold as Sheriff Ray Harris drove his patrol car across the still streets, the heater screaming against the chill that had settled deep in his. His head whirled with ideas of the unusual woman waiting in the park night after evening. Something about her story bothered him. He didn't want to care. He wasn't meant to be caring, but he couldn't get rid of the picture of her seated in the frigidity, awaiting a youngster who might never show. When Ree stopped at the park that night, the temperature had dropped dangerously low. Frost covered the benches, and when he got out of the car, the leaves crunched underfoot. The image of Eva curled on the same bench filled She seemed smaller tonight, as though the cold had caused her both guilt and frustration to shrink. Had thinned her clothing so that it provided minimal defense against the Biden walked near her. You're going to curse under his breath. Freeze to death out here, he shouted more fiercely. Then he meant Eva looked up her calm look unaltered while her hands shook slightly in her lap. Good evening, Sheriff. Ray raised his hands. This is frustrating. This is not a funny lady you will find sitting out here without waiting for a reply. She has pneumonia. He unbuttoned his thick patrol jacket and threw it over Eva's shoulders. She glanced at him in subdued astonishment. Though she said nothing, Ree sat down and saw the tiniest glimmer of thanks. Mostly on the seat next her, his breath condensing in the chilly air. Okay, right, he mumbled, you and I'll sit here with you. But should you not be willing to communicate, we will both freeze. Thank you, Sheriff. Eva gracefully pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders. They sat in silence, the only sound the wind's blown leaves creating ruckus.
Ed
Looked uncomfortably sideways at Eva, asking softly why you asked. Eva's hands stilled on her lap seemed to be collecting as you continued. After a protracted silence, her thoughts guiding whether or not to trust him with the truth spoke in a voice just above a whisper. Michael is my son. She started. He was jailed 20 years ago for a crime he did not commit. Ray leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. They reported he had robbed Eva's business. Her voice calm even with the tremor in her hands. She had witnesses who claimed to have seen him. Michael was with me that evening at home and knew he didn't do it. Ray wrinkled. So how could they attribute it to Eva's look dropped to her hands. There were no attorneys ready to battle for us, and the witnesses were lying, but who was going to trust the word of an impoverished black child? Over there's Ree felt a knot in his gut, but he pushed the sensation aside. That is rough. He mumbled, unsure of what else to say, as he grinned. Sadly, he assured me he would return back no matter how worried I should be. Long it took, I assured him I would wait just here in the park we used to. Ree stroked his face with a palm, feeling the weight of her words. Walking together. Over 20 years settle over him. Eva has been waiting that long. Nodded. Not every night at first, but later on when I learned he would be leaving soon I started visiting here, just in case. Ree fixated on her. Dumbfounded. And you truly believe he will show up? Yep, she said simply. He Ray's chest tightened. She was convinced in her voice. He didn't know what to say, how somebody could maintain that type of confidence over so much suffering, and why did it make him feel like the most important person in the world for questioning her? You ever suppose? Ray started, hesitating. I mean, what if he doesn't show Eva? She shook her head softly. He re-inhaled quickly, rubbing his hands together to keep them warm. I don't, he murmured. I don't get how you can sit out here every night waiting for something. Eva handed him. That might not happen. She gave him a little depressing note. Smile. Certain things are worth waiting for, Sheriff. Ree looked down at his hands. He considered all the things he could have done when her words sank firmly into his bones. Had never waited for the friendships he had let to fade, the family he had lived with. Threw aside for the first time in a long time the dreams he had given up.
Ray
Harris had a calm journey back to his residence. Ray parked his patrol car in the driveway and spent a lot of time staring at the dark windows in his house were too empty and silent. And for the first time in years, it disturbed him. The following day, he arrived at the station sooner than usually, entering the old case files. His fingertips floated across the keyboard as doubt noted at him, but something inside drove him ahead as he entered Michael's name. Jones, the screen flickering. Soon the case file showed him a robbery charge from 2 witness testimonies from 20 years ago, 2 non-physical. Researched the records, his frown growing. Anything about the case didn't feel right with him. The arrest had been rapid, the trial even proceeded faster, and the witnesses' remarks were almost exactly as though they had been. Ree sat back in his chair and felt a frigid sense of discomfort cover him. He was looking at a messy case hurried through the system with a sloppiness. Under his murmured under, young man threw aside like he didn't matter. Damned it. He slammed the laptop closed and massaged his temples. This was more than just. He had considered, and now that he knew, he couldn't ignore that evening. Rhee went back to the park, his head ablaze with all he had discovered. Eva was naturally there. Rhee sat down on her regular bench, her breath fogging in the cool air. Beside her, the weight of what he had discovered pressed hard on his chest. I stared. In the event of your son, Eva turned to him silently. Rhee breathed gently, looked serene but anticipatory. They messed. Eva nodded as clearly as if she had known all along. I suspected as much. Rhee leaned forward, resting his. I'm not sure what I can do, but I'm going to try. I'll dig farther and contact Eva. Elbows on his knees.
Ta.
And you, Sheriff Rhee. She seemed to be smiling, a warmth in her eyes not before seen. Shook his head, experiencing an odd mix of shame and fury. Thank you still. I still have a lot of to sort out. While they sat together in the chilly, odd calm settled down over Rhee. He had no idea how long it would take or what the result would be, but for the first time in years he felt like he was accomplishing something important and knew deep inside he wouldn't stop until he saw this through. Ray Harris's grip tightened around the steering wheel as his patrol car drove across the streets. The frigid, for the first time and for years, weight of truth sat firmly on his shoulders. Michael Jones's case was not only tangled in something substantially larger than his normal patrol responsibilities. A thoughtless error, it was an intentional distortion of justice, and now the truth threatened to undo all Rhee believed he knew about the law he had vowed to defend. Rhee stopped to get his when he pulled into front of the sheriff's station. Ideas, the strategy developing in his head seemed dangerous. He would have to migrate. Gently, he would be probing old wounds, calling out past errors among his peers. Would have preferred buried, but right now he entered the station without looking back. With a grimace, his fellow cops hardly looked up, used to his normal stern attitude, ignorant of the turmoil building inside him. Rhee began by exploring further into using past contacts to acquire records, the case files he contacted in a few favors. Those weren't easily accessible. Every lead he pursued verified his developing mistrust, the witnesses against Michael, under pressure from local police to make their tales fit a pre-written story. Worse, the shop robbed had hardly lost anything, but the young man had been sentenced to spend 20 years behind bars without parole. Rhee's fists closed, and the injustice of it all boiled inside. Unintentionally, as he scrolled over page after page of overwhelming proof, contradicting remarks, lacking evidence, and a court known for unfairly harsh penalties on black defendants, Rhee knew exactly what he was against. This, the department intended to keep a mess rather than merely a terrible case buried, and if he stirred things up, it wouldn't only be Michael's freedom on the line, it might also be his own reputation. His employment even permeated his life in this town. The instant he tried to ask for a official case review, the resistance hit hard. His captain called him into his office. Same afternoon, closing the door behind them. What the devil do you're doing, Harris? Captain Jenkins yelled angrily at Rhee. Rhee crossed his arms to establish his ground across the desk, staring into it. Jenkins laughed, reclining back in his old case, mocking the Jones robbery from 20 years ago. Case is dead and buried, Rhee. There is no point to be rummaging about it. Now there's every reason. Rhee shot back. Michael Jones was clearly consider the captain's darkening of your stride and dangerous ground here. Reopen that case, and you'll be dragging this entire department into the muck. Rhee clenched his fists, his knuckles white. So what should we do? Let Jenkins, an innocent man, remain in prison? Slammed his hand on the desk. Watch yourself, Harris. You are not a crusader. Rhee glared. Your role as a sheriff is to maintain peace, not cause disturbance. Down his jaw tight. Preserving the peace isn't the same as doing nothing. If we don't fix this, what the devil are we doing here? The captain's eyes closed. Rhee knew he could not. This isn't your struggle, leave it alone. Following all he had discovered that evening while patrolling the peaceful streets, Rhee discovered himself driving. Returning to the park, the wind was mercilessly cutting through the trees and clanging the naked limbs above, and still Eva sat on as usual, Her cloak closely wrapped her weak frame, waiting with the same quiet patience. Ray sat down beside her without anything, the cold seeping through his clothes. I investigated it, and ultimately his lengthy moment, none of which talked. Breath obvious in the cold air. I know what they did to your son. Eva didn't react straight away. She nodded as though she had always known, as though she had been waiting for more than just her son, but for anyone to believe her. I am working with Ray. Ongoing, but I know, Eva whispered. It won't be simple. Thank you. Ray tried to stave off the cold they would create by rubbing his hands together. My captain's already. Eva gave him a little knowing smile. They never make it simple. Sheriff, that's why we keep battling. Breathing down my neck. Ree sat back, exhaling gently. He had spent so many years keeping his head down, working without thinking twice now. Though it felt jumbled and confusing, everything also felt. And over the next 3 days, Ree put in great effort contacting attorneys and advocates, dragging every thread he could find. Encountered opposition at every turn. Old pals turned away, his station comrades got far apart. Jenkins urged him to drop it, but Ray didn't pay any attention. Couldn't. Late one night, after another demanding work, Ray discovered he was back. The sky was beautiful at the park. The stars were strewn like grains of salt across a black canvas. Eva arrived as usual. Ree offered her a steaming coffee cup and she grinned in thanksgiving, then gently corrected Cal, Sheriff Ray. Tommy. Ray watched the scene while silently sipping his coffee for some time. Stars. Why do you do what? Ree said finally. How do you keep going knowing the chances are stacked against you? Eva's sight. If I and then they succeed, I promised Michael I would be here. Ray nodded, a lump rising in his throat. He had never seen someone so robust, so relentless in the face of all. She reminded him of the kind of person he had always wanted to be, and Ray Harris sensed he was starting to be that guy for the first time in years. Once more, the next week was the toughest, but Ray's tenacity at last acquired the focus of a local journalist hired to investigate the matter. The article that followed placed the whole department under strict scrutiny, highlighting the injustice that had been committed. Buried for 2 decades, the reaction was instantaneous. Jenkins brought Ray into his office once more, furious. Harris, you have passed a line. You are on thin ice. His eyes were steady. Then I suppose I should learn how to skate. The research into Michael's situation started to gather steam, and with every day that passed, Ray could. Though the tide was beginning to change, the battle was far from done. Every triumph was greeted with opposition, every little advance challenged by those yearning to bury the past. Through it all, kept visiting Ray. Back at the park waiting with Eva, he never wavered or questioned. And her faith turned into the lighthouse, guiding Ray across the storm. I'm not sure how you accomplish this, Ray revealed one evening, his voice tired from weariness. You are stronger than everyone. Eva has always smiled softly. Every one of us has strength. Some of us just need guidance. Simply need a cause for it. Ree felt his throat tien with emotional intensity. Spent so many years following the routines, thinking his moment to change had passed, yet now sat beside this amazing beauty. He saw his fight was only fair. Starting the evening, the court consented at last to reopen Michael's case. Ree sat on the seat with Eva, observing the stars overhead. We are getting close, he muttered. Eva's eyes shimmered with subdued eagerness. I knew we would. Ray leaned back, exhaling a breath he had not noticed he had been holding for the first time in years. He sensed he was exactly where he was meant to be, and he knew unequivocally that he would not stop fighting until Michael Jones was Libra. The day of the last court hearing arrived with an unannounced stillness. The normal buzz of the sheriff's department appeared to recede as Ray Harris sat at his desk, tapping a pen anxiously against the edge of an old notepad. This was months of persevering under opposition while excavating records and calling in every advantage he had ever acquired. All of it resulted at this instant. Ray hadn't mentioned the hearing because didn't want to let Eva's hopes down till he knew he was terrified she would lose if things went against their expectations. Hope that had maintained her seated on that bench every night for all those years. The notion of seeing her broken after everything was more than he could handle. He grabbed his jacket cautiously and turned toward the courthouse. The weight of his badge on his chest had never felt like this. Ray sought a seat. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, heavier within. A few reporters were there, looking for recognizable faces in the rear, searching the crowd for those same ones who had watched the case since it was reopened. Most of the guests were strangers. They came Michael Jones, just viewers waiting for the result of a story they scarcely knew then. Ree's heart fell as he watched the young man personally for the first time. Michael's shoulders appeared worn down from years of incarceration. He looked exhausted, stooped beneath the weight of all life had thrown at him, but his eyes bore the same stillness. The resolve Ree had seen in Eva's was one of someone who had been battling for far too long but refused to give up. The judge. She sat down, and the proceeding started. Ree paid great attention as the proof they had unearthed the coerced witness testimonies from a lawyer Michael had assisted in locating, the absence of tangible evidence, and the deliberate mistreatment of the original. Every element seemed like a nail in the coffin of Injustice G, and, with reference to every point the attorney raised, Ray's hope grew somewhat stronger, until last the judge leaned forward, her expression bland yet strong. She declared the choice in A. Michael Jones's measured voice was scheduled for release. Ray couldn't breathe comfort right away, hence his chest overflowed and he slumped back into his seat, astounded by the weight of it all. He turned to Michael, stayed immobile, as though he hadn't yet understood what had just happened. Then the young guy closed. Rewatched the first flutter of peace cross his eyelids and exhaled slowly. Ray waited outside the courtroom, his patrol car idle by the curb. When, at last, Michael passed through the doors, the two men locked eyes for the first time. Ray nodded slightly. Not sure what to say. Your Sheriff Harris urged his voice to be quiet, but steady. Ray cleared his throat. That's me. Michael grinned tiredly. Ray laughed gently and scratched the back of his neck.
My mother told me about him.
She stood there silently for a minute, the weight of all that had transpired hanging in. Ree remarked, finally nodding toward the patrol car, the air between them changing. Two men lost. Someone is waiting for you on the way to the park. Ray peered at Michael from the corner of his eye and his own thoughts. The way the young man appeared to unwind the closer they approached, it was as though, after all these years, he was at last moving towards something actual, and something thing Ree noticed when they arrived at the park belonged to him. Eva seated on her normal bench, her coat snugly wrapped about her. Ray's throat tightened when she arrived, exactly as she did every night.
He
turned to Michael, seated still in the passenger seat with gaze fixed on the image of his mother. Ready? Ree asked. Michael slowly nodded, his hands, which shook slightly as he unlocked the door and emerged into the frigid. Ree watched from a distance as Michael walked gently toward the bench. Eva turned to see. Soften the moment she heard Michael speak. Eva Rose was breaking to her feet, tears running down her cheeks as she pulled her son into a close embrace, hugged each other for what seemed like endless years. Gap fading away in that 1 minute. Ree stood beside his car, his chest close with feeling. He had witnessed many career reunions, but none like this. This was something else, sacred, and for the first time in a long while. Ray let himself feel it. He cleaned his eyes with the back of his hand. Michael and Eva sat on the seat, murmuring under his breath, terrible, filthy dust. Their hands entwined as if neither of them ever planned to let go. Once more, Ray granted them their space, resting against his car, and watched as the scene developed like a long-awaited sunrise. After some time, Eva looked up and responded Ree with a nod, a small thank you smile. He felt warmth that he hadn't known he needed. Michael turned toward Ray, dispersed over him, voice full of thanks for everything. Ree shook his head. You don't. I have to thank you. Your mother is the actual hero here. I merely followed her direction. Eva laughed gently, removing tears from her cheeks. He is stubborn, this one. But I knew you would come through. Sheriff Ray, grinning to release the strain in his chest. At last, yeah, well, I suppose I have a thing for lost causes. Michael and Esther looked at each other, their link unbreakable, created by years of hope and perseverance, and knew this was what Ree stood there observing them had been looking for all along, with a feeling of direction and a cause to have faith in. Something other later, as the three of them sat on the bench, Ray sensed the cold no longer cut at his skin. Serene contentment settled over him, and the night no longer felt so empty. We're going to be okay now, Eva whispered, squeezing her. Michael's hand grinned as he rested his head on her shoulder. Yes, Mom. We are. Ray slanted back, staring at the dark stars strewn around the night sky. For the first time in years, Ness felt not so heavy, that he was exactly where he should be, and he knew without a doubt. I suspect that this was merely the beginning. The air was cool and calm as Ray Harris drove his patrol car into Eva and Michael's small house's driveway. The town felt less busy then. Normal, almost as though the weight resting on it for years had at last lifted. Ray parked and left, one hand carrying a bag of groceries. The early morning light softly illuminated the streets, hinting of fresh. He moved, approaching the front door, where Eva greeted him kindly. She smiled differently now, lighter, as though a lifetime of sorrow had at last finally. Michael's absence had brought life back into her morning. Sheriff Eva stated, opening the door wide. Early morning, Ray said with a little smile. I advised you only to call Eva. She laughed at old habits. Ray came on inside though the furniture was aged and the walls showed the marks of years gone by. The house seemed comfortable. The groceries were set on. Michael stared at the tiny kitchen table where he sat enjoying his breakfast, more at ease since his shoulders were free from imaginary weight. Thank you for stopping, Ray. Michael greeted with a grin. Would not miss it, Ray answered while seated at the table, glancing at the wall clock. Michael gave a little shrug. The job hunt is still under development. Not many people ready to employ someone with my type of background. Ray nodded, knowing the annoyance in Michael's voice. Will help us. There are people in town who owe me 2 favors or more. Eva poured Ray a cup of coffee. You back on your feet, and sat down across from him. Thus far, she said silently. We'll be driven to make the rest of the distance. Ray grinned at her comments, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had been acquainted with throughout the last 2 weeks. Spent so much of his life following the rules, believing his opportunity to really change had passed, but he had discovered something he hadn't known he was seeking for here with these 2 guys, something outside the insignia. As the 3 of them sat together, a comfortable silence enveloped the room. It was not the kind of silence derived from emptiness, but the kind that came from belonging. Ra hadn't felt in years, and discovered he was clinging to the moment, not wanting it to vanish in the next drove Michael to job interviews, vouchsafed, helping him with everything he could for him with the nearby companies, and even linked him to a community group trying to rehabilitate past. Though the route was difficult, Michael tackled every obstacle with the same. The people started to see too that his mother had borne for all those years calm determination. Michael's story, once a subdued tragedy concealed beneath prejudice, became a story of hope and redemption. Those who had earlier turned away started to provide their little help. First gestures, but meaningful ones. One day, when Ree sat with Eva on, she gazed over at him from the park bench where it all started, a grin bearing both tranquility and thanksgiving. Saved us, Ree, she whispered gently. Ree shook his head. You saved yourselves. I only gave. Either way, Eva laughed at a tiny prod of her hand. I'm glad. The sun closed his eyes for a moment, dipped lower in the heavens, showering the park in a warm golden light. Ray, as the moment's fragment washed over him, it wasn't only Michael and Eva who had been rescued, came to see that he had been saved too in some kind. Re-established a communal library initiative to assist Michael, and it developed more quickly than anybody had predicted. It started as a little concept and evolved into a hive for the whole town. Parents brought their children to volunteer book and computer donations, complete homework. Even older residents came to pick up fresh skills. The old, once a deserted structure on Main Street, it was turned into a hive of activity and education that transcended mere physicality. Library, it represented what the town might be when people gathered. Ree discovered he was spending more time at the library than he had ever imagined, helping the children with their arithmetic assignments, taught elderly people how to write emails, and even participated in a weekly reading club. It seemed odd at first being part Something so different from the realm of law enforcement that Ray found, because it provided him something policing never had a sense of belonging a chance. Instead than merely enforce, Michael started showing up often at the library as well. He taught children science, sharing his ambition of one day. Once he started working as an engineer, his presence in the society gradually started to influence how people perceived him as someone with the rather than as a man having spent time behind bars. One clear evening when Ree shut the library for the evening, he noticed Michael. Ree asked Michael, waiting at the door smiling, a ride home. Shook his head. I just wanted to say thanks. Ray arched an eyebrow. For what? For everything, Michael answered. You gave me another chance. Without you. Ray's throat clenched, and I wouldn't be here. He turned aside momentarily, blinking back, the feeling welling in his eyes. Hell, kid, Ray said, I believe you have done more for me than I ever could have for you. Michael grinned, knowingly. Perhaps we saved. Ree nodded slightly, sensing a great degree of satisfaction settle in his. For Michael and Eva, as much as for him, the future seemed bright. And for the first time in years, Ray Harris realized he wasn't merely policing a community, he was living in part of a society, any that has become more resilient from their fight for it. Together the seasons changed, and life kept on its forward path. Ray spent more and more time with Eva and Michael, joining their family in a way that seemed natural. On calm evenings, they would sit on the same bench Eva had sat on, seeing the sun all those nights set over the park, knowing they had discovered something worthy of clinging on to. The once dragging Ray down weight gave way to a lightness he had not known in years. His badge felt more like a reminder of the decisions than a weight. He had discovered life along the road and the individuals he had assisted. As the sun sank below the horizon, Ray leaned back on the bench, a tiny smile pulling at his lips. He turned to see Eva and Michael seated side by side, their link unbreakable. For the first time in a long time, Ray Harris felt really at ease, and he was sure this was only the start of something wonderful. If this tale moved you, thank you for viewing. Make sure you hit that. Click the subscribe button to avoid missing more compelling narratives such as this one. Your support means everything. Desire more? Check the next. Remember to browse video. We have another tale ready to inspire you. You won't regret it. The remainder of our videos. Disclaimer. This channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.